Right, so who needs another video about how to drill holes? I mean, for God's sake. You know, it's not hard to drill a hole, and there are, frankly, hundreds of demonstrations on the details in doing this. But I'm interested primarily in a very specialized thing. And there are some YouTubes out there. There are some lots of really good advice, and I've tried many of them, and so I'm not trying to repeat all that information. I just want to share what has, I think, worked for me. So about 6 months ago, I've been asking questions of people, trying to figure out if there were good ways that people had figured out to do this, because what I'm trying to do is drill very tiny holes in very small pieces of silver, copper, and gold. And that's so that I can produce filagree, or hand-cut pieces of jewelry and ornament. And that creates a couple of special challenges when you're doing it by hand. And you know, there are many things you can do easily, but doing this by hand is a little challenging. So I've put together a very short video, because in the last 6 months or so, I've tried about a half a dozen or more things. Whatever works for you, that's what you do, right? And there's not one way to do it, but this I've found is the way that has worked for me quite well. And in the past month or so, I've been able to drill a couple thousand holes and only broken a few bits. And I'm drilling anywhere from 300 micron to 500 micron holes through typically 16 gauge sterling or less. So it's not a huge amount of holes, but if this is the kind of thing that you're interested in doing, stay tuned for a minute. I'll show you what I've got. Well, it's not an unreasonable question to ask what kind of drill bits I use. But right now, frankly, I'm still experimenting. And what I can tell you is, obviously, what most people say is don't buy the cheapest ones. And that's probably accurate. The cheapies, especially these straight shanks that you can get in bulk from discount stores and places like that, they're high-speed steel, which I like. But they will, yeah, they may work for you, but they're unlikely to be very good. But that's okay, you know. They have a use. I think they're better in wood and plastic than they are in metal. But I've bought them. I don't tend to use them. These inexpensive carbide drill bits or high-speed router things, those work pretty well. But I found the carbide is so brittle that it can be not worth spending a lot of time on. The nice thing is, this batch, for example, comes from 0.1 or 100 microns all the way to a millimeter, 0.2 or so. So for some of the smaller drill bits, you know, if you're very careful with them, they can serve you well. But generally, I've found I tend to like these just standard drill bits that would fit in a Fordham. They have a 3/32 shank. And the ones I use the most are 0.5 millimeter, which are kind of small. As far as brand is concerned, frankly, I don't know which is best. I think, in my experience so far, my limited experience, most of the breakage I've experienced, I'm pretty much convinced is user error. In other words, my screw up. So I've bought a couple of different batches from different places, and they all work reasonably well. I pretty much use mostly 0.5, 0.7, and 1 millimeter. So I found that anything above like 1 millimeter or so, I can just use my Fordham and by hand, and that's just not a problem. For other things, though, that really became a problem. I found these drill bits. These are actually quite nice. It's these fine pivot bits. These are really great for the 300 micron. I don't even know if you can see that. It's a 1 millimeter shank, has a very short cutting depth. These are very sturdy, and they work really well, at least in a drill press. And 300 microns or 0.3 millimeters is about the smallest that's practical to worry about for piercing jewelry. because the 10-aught or 10/0 saw blade is, I found, the smallest commercially available blade, and it barely fits in a 300 micron hole. So anything smaller than that, you know, might be kind of interesting, but it's not worth doing. Anyway, that's what I've been using for drill bits. It's possible to resharpen them, but frankly, and I can resharpen them under the microscope. There's an advantage to doing it, but I've been working under a microscope for about 35 years, so I don't really recommend people spending too much time with that. But you know, even though I can resharpen them, I usually don't, because it takes a bit to do, and I get about a 60% success rate. So it's worth doing, but almost not. Okay, so in terms of drills, pretty much anything. Most of it's user error, and also there's a few tips that I'll try to give about what I managed to set up to drill successfully. Well, for anything under or over about a millimeter or so, I just use the Fordham and my handheld drill. I have tried a Dremel, and I've even tried a Dremel in a drill press stand, and for a variety of reasons, it hasn't worked for me that well. What I discovered using my Fordham and working by hand was a problem for me, is mostly that although I can do it, and I love the control of speed you get with the Fordham and the touch, it's really important that you have a good feel for what's happening with the drill bit. I couldn't drill them straight, and for most things, for larger openings, say more than a couple millimeters, that's not a problem. But when I was getting into these very fine filigree things, where the gap between openings might be 100 to 300 microns, drilling anything less than perpendicular holes is a real problem. So I've hunted around a lot. And what I've done so far, I'm still not convinced it's perfect, but I've actually drilled a couple, maybe 1,000 holes successfully with this. I bought a relatively inexpensive, dedicated mini drill press that has one of these controls on it that allows you to go from relatively slow to higher speeds. And then it also has in here a set of pulleys, so you have 3 different ranges of speed to choose from. And I recommend choosing the lowest speed range, so that you go from just a couple hundred RPMs to 2,500 at the most. Because it turns out I've had the best success working with the slowest possible speeds on these drills, especially the ones that are like 0.3 to 0.5 millimeters. So again, you don't have to do something like this, but for me, spending $85 when I've been drilling thousands of little tiny holes is probably a very, very good investment, because it is one of those things that helps me avoid breaking drill bits, and I keep the holes nice and perpendicular, and it really enhances my work. So I highly recommend that. One of the issues with this press, and with any other press really, that's critical that you fix or take care of before you start drilling, is the issue of run out. Run out you can think of as the wobble in the drill bit as it spins. If this thing isn't perfectly in alignment with the axis of rotation, it will have just a little bit of a wiggle. And with these drill bits, even a few thousandths of an inch of run out is disastrous. It'll catch and snap the bit. So that's one of the problems using your hand when you use these really tiny ones. But it turns out that I was able to sort of fidget with this and get it to be pretty darn good. This is an inexpensive drill press that has bearings and there's a bearing here and then a bearing up here at the top. So there's two bearings, you can't see it, but there's two bearings in this axis. And what I first determined was that by putting a measuring device on the spindle, that this was really, really nice. There was no run out at all from the pulleys to the main drive or the quill. Now what happens though is this chuck is friction fit there, and so the first thing you have to do is pull that off. You just take a screwdriver and pry that chuck off. Make sure that's absolutely clean on both surfaces, and then just repress it and push it into a wooden block to give it a little pressure. Once you're sure that that's in there really nicely, then you put a bit in and see if it's going to be aligned. Now, what happens typically is that the three jaws of these chucks, especially this one, they're quite serviceable, especially for larger diameter shank drill bits. But I discovered on this one, there was a very tiny set of imperfections on the inside surface of these three jaws, and no matter what I did, there was significant run out or wobble. So I took the chuck off, and if you were going to do this right, you would mount this whole chuck in a lathe, and using very, very accurate machining, you would run a driller or a file or something in the middle of these three jaws to make sure they were true. But it turned out what I did was just take a file, very small needle file, and just very gently gave a couple of files on the inside edge of these three jaws and closed them nicely. And for me, that worked. I don't recommend doing it. It's just that that's what I did, and that's what worked, because you could ruin one of these things really fast. The next thing you have to be aware of is that when you tighten your drill bit, first just snug it up by hand. Make sure that it's centered and not caught in between two of those, so that's real easy to happen. And then you don't use one of these holes to cream down on it and tighten down all the way. Just turn it a little bit, and then do the next one, and turn it a little bit, and then do the third one, turn it a little bit, and keep down. Now you keep going, and you tighten all three as evenly as possible, because that's what the biggest problem is that people have. That will give you there's just a little bit too much tension on one jaw compared to the other two, and that'll send you off a couple thousandths. So doing those things makes the bit spin really quite nicely, and that's exactly what you need to have. The other thing you're going to want is a source of light, and so I bought these relatively inexpensive LEDs on flexible shafts, and these are really quite nice because you can position it where you want it, and then that gives you adequate light for the job. Well, before I show you drilling, I'm going to drill a couple of holes. I won't be talking while I'm drilling, so I just want to point out what I do. One of the things you want to be sure you're doing is holding your work very flat and steady, and have beeswax. I prefer beeswax as a lubricant, primarily because I'm a beekeeper and I have access to really nice beeswax. But use something, a soap, a candle, Burlife, something to lubricate your bits. What I will be showing you is my technique, and so what I'm doing is I'm really very carefully using fingertip control to push on this lever so that I can actually feel when the thing touches, and I can gauge, I can feel if there's any vibration, feel if it's entering, and then I'm watching the chips spiral out of the flutes, and that tells me that the bit is cutting really, really well. So the other thing I'm going to be doing is, after I lubricate and I do this, I'm going to be touching and going. So I almost never drill by putting a lot of pressure on it and just going. So what I'll do is I'll start it, See the chips? And then I'll let go. Let the chips come out of the hole and away from the drill bit. There, see? And so oftentimes, this is a piece of 16 gauge sterling. Oftentimes it'll take me 5 or 6 or more penetrations to get a hole drilled, but when it's done, it's very, very clean, very nice. I haven't burnt anything or broken anything, and that works perfectly well. I've seen different recommendations for different materials that advise you to go at high speed. I just have not had a great deal of luck at the higher speeds with these drill bits. I think they heat up, or basically, you know, an infinitesimally small amount of wiggle or run out at a very high speed is instantaneously disastrous. It's just catastrophic failure. So going slow is my preferred method. Okay, so this one would go up to 2,500, and at 2,500 that can be handy if you need to like start a hole, because you can just touch and it'll make a little dimple, and that's really nice. But the chips will be pretty small. I think the heat develops quite quickly, and I just don't prefer to do it that way. So I'm going to be going slow, multiple passes, and just it cuts really, really perfectly smoothly that way.